Saffron is next with a presentation about art directing studios. If you have questions, you can ask in the chat. Let's take it away.
Hello, my name is Saffron Aurora. I'm an art director at MightyL working on The Big Con. Today I'll be talking about art direction and the art of the Big Con, how to art direct a game only 90s kids will remember when you barely remember the 90s. So, yep, that's me. You're probably wondering how I got here, and by here I mean being an art director for this game. So I've been with MightyL for about 2 years now, but prior to that I worked at Drinkbox Studios on Guacamelee 2 as a 2D artist. Since then I've also worked with Vertex Pop as an illustrator for Super Crush KO, and I've also started my own game studio, Kitten Cup Studio. But before becoming an art director, I was a freelance artist who worked in games and comics. I made art and I made friends, and I kept making art and friends, hoping that someone would think I was cool enough to hire me, and that someone was Dave Proctor, CEO of MightyL, who was looking to fill an artist position on the Big Con at the time. So because I did a little bit of everything and I had experience in making video games, I was able to take on a larger role at a smaller studio by wearing many hats. But before I get into the nitty-gritty of sort of art and art direction, let's talk about the game. So The Big Con is a puzzle adventure game where you play as Allie, a teen con artist in the 90s on a journey to save her family video store from loan sharks. So it's a game set in the 90s, designed to feel like the 90s, or at least how we remember it. It's a con artist adventure with mechanics and references to con artist tropes and schemes. Allie does a lot of conning and pickpocketing, and it's a coming-of-age comedy, so it has plenty of thematic humor. Yeah, and now that we're all caught up on what the game is all about, let's talk about art directing. So the art director has the responsibility of creating a cohesive aesthetic throughout a project. They communicate with the they communicate with the creative director, who oversees the direction of the entire project and sort of helping them shape their vision. So, for example, if the creative director says they want a game that looks and feels like the 90s, it's my job as the art director to figure out what exactly that means. So for me, freelancing and art direction are already pretty similar, since they both required me to listen to what a client wants and then create something based on that. The biggest difference is that, when you're a freelancer, usually you're getting hired for something a lot smaller, like concept art or illustration, but for larger projects like a video game, you have to take all of the moving parts into consideration. So generally, studios have multiple people doing different jobs, but since we're a relatively small studio right now, I was mostly art directing myself at the beginning until we brought on more artists. So my process of finding an art style can be broken up into 3 loose stages: research, refinement, and reiteration. Yes, I also really like alliteration. So the early stages of a project, or the research, is mostly about mood boarding and looking for inspiration and sort of exploring all of these different ideas. And then once you've found and sort of narrowed in on what the key inspiration is and references that you're looking for, you can use that to sort of form this cohesive art style. And then once you have your cohesive art style, then there's a reiteration. So that's once you've made the art tests and you've put it in the game, how the game affects the art tests, and sort of navigating the technical hiccups of making this art playable. So mood boarding. I love mood boarding. I love Pinterest. I love the visualness of it. So, a lot of cool things came out of the 90s. It's very recognizable. Tamagotchis, fanny packs, me. So obviously you don't need to have experienced something firsthand in order to make a piece of media about it, but what you do need is a bunch of research and creativity. So sort of taking all of this information and how do we process that back, through our game, through our art style. So I spend, like I said, a lot of time on Pinterest and Google Images, and it's at this stage where I try to keep a really open mind, and I look to everything for inspiration, like songs, food, clothing, anything that I think could sort of lead to interesting choices in the game. But because mood boarding can have a really overwhelming amount of information, what I really like personally about Pinterest is that you can organize your mood board into these sort of mini section boards. So usually I'll organize my mood boards into specific categories so that I can quickly reference them later. Usually I'll try to separate content inspiration from style inspiration. So things like fashion and environment are more on the design side, whereas things like the color palettes and the new aesthetic, any sort of art boards or art images, more influence the visual style. But before I came onto the BigCom, the game actually had a completely different art style, art directed by the very talented Lindsay Gallant. It was this, lineless rendered art style with a more muted palette and exaggerated perspectives and proportions that were, evocative of early 90s cartoon characters. There was, an entirely different character named Rookie, who was this sort of classic 90s boy, with the middle part and sort of this grungy look to him. And these were some of the earliest concepts that I did for the game, which was this, the gas station and this train car, which were these key locations. And there's also a style test to make sure that I could replicate, their current style and work on the project. In this case, I didn't really have to do any style mood boarding because it had already been done for me. There was already a style that they were using. So mostly it was just gathering references for design, signs, and environment and stuff like that, which in a sense was easier. But how did the style, evolve from this desaturated rendered art style to the current hypersaturated cartoonish one? And one of the honest reasons was simply because I wasn't very good at it. It was something that it got easier the more I practiced, and sure I could do it, but it wasn't something that came naturally to me. Since I mostly have a background in illustration and in comics, sure I've done painting and rendering, but you want to hire an artist or an art director who's comfortable at this art style, who enjoys doing this art style and that it comes naturally to. And this just wasn't something that came as naturally to me as sort of this flat line art and these bright colors. So we also wanted the art style to be something that was immediately in your face and loud, that it was a 90s game. So I sort of took from the current style that they had at the time what they were already emphasizing, these sort of exaggerated proportions and the pops of neon in the menu, which were really eye-catching, and then I used that as the base for redesigning the art style. So these are some of the images that ended up being the key style images, the key base for our art style. We looked at a lot of 90s cartoons because, again, I was born in the 90s. I don't really remember most of it, but, in the late 90s and the early 2000s, they were still playing cartoons from the 90s. So I looked at, things like Hey Arnold and Doug and Rocco's Modern Life and sort of any illustrations that evoked this feeling of, even if it wasn't from the 90s, but this feeling of 90s cartoon. So, that usually meant things like memorable silhouettes with exaggerated body parts, funky patterns, black line art, and using unconventional colors for people and buildings. So this is one of my early style tests. You can see how those influences from the mood board sort of manifested here. You can see we have a sort of a bug-eyed alley where she has the same neon colors and the hard black shadows that ended up in the final style, but we thought that the eyes were a little too cartoonish, so I sketched out a version with a smaller head and eyes, which would become the base for Allie's final design. This was also inspired by, there was one of my style tests at the top right there, dubbed Cool Girl. She was just a very cool girl, where I played with these super bright and fun colors, and I tried both just a flat color and then one with these very intense shadows. And these, Dave really liked, Cool Girl, and who wouldn't like Cool Girl? She's just so cool. But that really sort of influenced our final style later on too. I didn't really do too much style testing for the environment art because I didn't really have a good idea of what buildings we needed, and sort of concepting these buildings at the time would have taken more work than what we needed. There's some building art in the next slide, but we looked at a lot of Wibble Build, which is something I had to Google today, also known as hidden picture books, so sort of like Where's Waldo, since that was another popular 90s childhood reference. And it was full of bright colors and thick lines and fun characters. And one of the things I really took from all of these images, what I really liked was these sort of duotone. So, even if it was the same building, like the front of a building might be pink, but the side of a building might be blue. And that's because that's the shadow. And, playing with light and these different saturated colors was a lot of fun. So once we had settled on the new art style, the next step is making key art and sort of running a bunch of visual development mock-ups to see how the art will work in the game and how it might look. So sort of starting from the top left, that was one of my animation tests. I will say that I am not an animator, but again, many hats. I was still able to do enough for creating this animation that established sort of the feeling that we wanted these, the animation to have, this sort of squishy, talking, cartoonish character. And then I had some mock-ups for how conversation might look, both in, our NPC view, which is the close-up of the character, and then how it might look in the environment view where they're all sort of far away. And in the top right corner, that's also a mock-up for how we thought the menu might look. We had this idea that saved games were these VHS tapes, and that there was this TV, and every time you wanted to play one of your saved games or one of your files, because you can play the game in many different ways. The game is meant to be played over and over again because you want to try out different ways of getting through the game. You would put the tape in, and that would be your save file. But also it would be this physical space that would fill up with collectibles that you would gather, across your playthroughs. And then the last one in the bottom right there, that was one of the environment key arts that I made. I actually made it by going into Google Streets, Google Maps, yeah. And sort of cutting up these buildings, looking for this sort of cityscape, cutting up these buildings and then putting them together in this collage, getting these exaggerated perspectives and then using that as a reference. And I still really like it. I still really like that piece too. So reiteration. It comes into how do we make this art into a game? How do we make it playable? So even though I had drawn a bunch of cool characters with these unique poses, unless you're drawing them as flat animation frames, you're not going to have a lot of versatility, which is what we needed. We wanted to have a certain level of flexibility. We wanted to have different, resolutions, from being able to have a conversation with a character up close to sort of seeing them from far away. What does that look like? How do we have art that looks like a cartoon but acts like a vector? And this is when we tried using SDFs, which you can see at some of the art tests at the bottom there. So SDFs, or assigned distance fields, I don't really know what they are, how they work, other than they're kind of like vectors and that they use math. But we tried them out for a while, which was this sort of convoluted process, at least for me, like the pipeline, where I would make a character and then I would remake them as vectors, and then I would duplicate the vectors and then export also just the outline, exported the shadows as their own maps, and then sort of put everything together in Unity. And for a while we got it very, somewhat close to the art style that we wanted, but the problem was that they kept on breaking, which resulted in, some really hilarious looking bugs, but it ended up being an art pipeline that just wasn't feasible, for us. So we switched it up. We ended up having it so that instead of exporting the characters in this, going through the SDFs, they're now just, PNGs. They're black and white so that we can color them in Unity. And in a total rookie move, reiteration, again, I was exporting these characters in these, unique silhouetted idle poses, which is bad. Don't do that, because then you'll have to do what I did, which was redo them in their boring but very riggable T-pose, which, is much better for animation. And the black and white was also great too, because then we could change the colors anytime we wanted in Unity. The only, sort of handoff with that is you don't have as much detail that you can put into this baked in art, like things like highlights or patterns, but we ended up actually later on finding out a solution to that through shaders. So like I said, the process is very iterative. So finally, here is a look at our environment art pipeline and sort of how it all comes together. So we work pretty horizontally so that, my work doesn't block anybody else. So this comes in stages of the rough art, the clean art, and then the final art. So I start at the beginning with sourcing an environment from the mood board or Google Images as my base. Sometimes I'll use one environment, sometimes I'll stitch together several images, but reference images are your friends. I don't know what I would do without reference images. And then next, I'll sort of sketch out what, our version of the environment should roughly look like. And then I'll get Dave's approval, since he's both the creative director and the level designer. So at this point, I'll save the rough, and then we'll put that in the game as a placeholder for gray boxing until I've finished and exported the clean art. So the clean art is when I sort of divide all of these pieces into their own groups and layers. I name all of them with the proper name that they'll have, for going in the game. And that way, when I do the final art later and I re-export them, everything is already set up in Unity. All of the parts are set up, all of the colliders are set up. People can test, even though the art isn't looking how it should look in the end, it's still the building blocks for how the room will play. And then after that, it's just a matter of doing the final art and then replacing all of those pieces. And that's it. I hope you enjoyed my talk on art direction and the Big Con. And once again, I'm Saffron Aurora. If you'd like to reach out to me, you can contact me on social media or through my email. And the Big Con is now available to wishlist on Steam. So thank you.
Alrighty, thanks so much. Clap, clap, clap. Everybody make 1,000 clap words and or emojis in the, I don't know, does Twitch have clap emojis? That was amazing. Thank you so much, Saffron. It's so cool to see a process. I really like that you were able to show some of the tools that you've used and or decided not to use. Same thing with your pipeline. to go over some of the questions that were asked in chat. And if anybody else has any questions for Saffron in chat, please ask, and I can repeat them here on the stream as well. Some people asked a little bit about the process of mood boarding and when to share. So she said that the kind of basics get fleshed out mostly between her and the director, and then being able to share at stages with other team members for input, or hey, did I miss anything, or anything like that has been super useful. That's also been my experience with similar things. And it sounds like a lot of people were asking a little bit about kind of test groups too, and seeing how that works, and it sounds like that's mostly up to the team, which, I mean, I think it's fine because the game's looking really, really good. Congratulations on what you've been able to do with it so far and everything. It looks awesome. Oh, and we have a wish list link popping in the chat right now. So yeah, pop in and wish list. I actually have not done that, so well, I'll make sure to do that. I don't think we'll Steam. We won't Steam Fall Festival your wish lists for you, but let's get a good, oh my god, if we got 10 wish lists on the VidCon by the end of tonight, then that means like 20% of our stream would have wish listed, which would be awesome. And we're all gamers. Come on, you got to do it. Awesome. Thank you so much. Yeah. Oh yeah. And Dave, the creative director, is also in the chat right now. If anybody has any other questions, please ask. And yeah, it was awesome to have you, Saffron. We'll follow up, and maybe we can all play like Among Us in the PIGSquad Discord someday.